Okay, nice to have you all back. I hope that you enjoyed the learning. I know some people experience a bit of technical issues with printing, using the sheets, et cetera. You'll have to come into a rhythm of what works for you best. So I just want to remind you, there's options. You can print everything, or you can use the designed sheets and fill them in on the screen if that works for you. And if you're in a breakout room, best thing is to share this, have one person share the screen and everybody work together. Okay, so I'm going to now share my screen, and just unfortunate I won't be able to see everybody, but we're going to now go through the sources. Okay, here goes. So our idea is that we have a situation where people were taken into captivity. The first thing that we're not really clear about, and I know I went into some of the rooms and it was one of the first questions that I got in the room I went into, which is who took them into captivity, for what reason, what type of captives are we talking about here? There was even a bit of confusion as to who were the captives. So what we're talking about is Jewish captives that were taken into captivity by some Gentile, we don't know who, what the issue is and why. It seems to be, and we'll see this later in the commentaries, it seems to be a purely financial thing, almost like a kidnapping, okay, for money. Not as much that there's life-threatening, although we're going to get back to this issue. So it says here, Ein podina tashvuyim. We're on the Mishnah in Gittin, it's chapter 5, Mishnah 6, which is also found on Daf 45a. Ein podina tashvuyim yeter al k'dei demehem. The rabbi, mipnei tikun olam. So the rabbis institute that even though our gut would tell us that somebody's taken into captivity, we all know this goes on, unfortunately, in Israel. And everybody always says we have to, right? Well, I shouldn't say everybody, and I don't want to get into politics and do we, don't we? But there's this sense that Tikun Olam, if you would ask me Tikun Olam, I would say life is more important than anything else, and having somebody in captivity is a terrible thing. Of course, you have to redeem them. Comes the Mishnah and says exactly the opposite. You're not allowed to redeem them for more than their worth. Okay, what's the next obvious question that comes up? How do you value the worth of a person, right? What does it mean, more than their worth? If you ask somebody's parents, they'll say they're worth, any amount in the world. There is nothing that's yeter al k'dei demehem. So it's another question, and this is something that the Sugya actually does not really get into, which is, what is the worth of a person? And that's something actually that's discussed a lot in the Masechet Erechim and other places where there are values put on a person, and often it's kind of what they would go for in the slave market, which is hard for us to understand. But we have to, unfortunately, for our purposes today, we're going to put those issues aside. Okay, for now, we're going to put aside the issue, why were they taken into captivity, which we're going to open up in the second part of today's class. The second part is how much they're worth. We're going to just assume a person is worth whatever X amount. And what we're saying is you can't go X plus 1, okay? X plus 1, you cannot redeem them at that point. Mipnei tikun olam. So the Mishnah just tells us Tikun Olam, for the betterment of the world. You're going with the translation of the Koran, for the betterment of the world. There could be other ways one could define what Tikun Olam is, but basically we want to improve a particular situation, so we're not going to do it. The next line of the Mishnah, which we'll get back to soon, is Ein mavrichim tashvuyim. Also don't allow them, we don't help them to escape mipnei tikun olam. And this part of the Mishnah is even more confusing because number one, it doesn't really tell us what tikun olam is. And the second thing is Rashbag, who presumably disagrees, that's short for Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, says mipnei takanat hashvuyim. What's the difference between tikun olam, takanat shvuyim, right? Takanat shvuyim literally means, right, because we want to make it better for the people in captivity. So we're not going to help people be saved for the people in captivity. So we'll have to explain what this means. Okay, so what I wanted to show you here is that Rashi basically tells us, Mipnei takanat hashavim, in case you didn't know what that meant, Rashi usually is very helpful. When you get to something in the Gemara, you don't know what it means, Rashi often defines a lot of things. So Rashi simply says here, Gemara mefaresh la, which basically means it's confusing, there's no simple answer, and wait till the Gemara deals with it. So for that reason, I said in the question here, you can maybe take the advice and wait till the Gemara deals with it, or maybe you've kind of thought about it on your own. So now we're going to move to the Gemara. And what I want to first do is I want to read through the Gemara, and I want to give you some tips for punctuating. Okay, so how do you learn how to punctuate? So it was nice to hear that some people told me that because they learned Daf Yomi every day, it's helped them with punctuation. And even though they never learned Gemara before 2 years ago, now they know how to punctuate because they've just been hearing the rhythm of the Gemara day after day. So I will say that if you want to learn Gemara, Daf Yomi isn't necessarily the best way to get tools for learning Gemara, but just hearing it over and over and over, it just kind of becomes ingrained in you. So it's actually nice to have a combination where you're having a class that's focusing specifically on methodology and you're getting the daily dose of Gemara. So it's helpful. Anyway, Ibayalihu. Ibayalihu means a question was asked. Okay. This is, I know Rabbanit Leah spoke about this in the course for those who were there about the Stama de Gemara. It's a Stam question not asked by anyone in particular. And the question is, Hai mipnei Tikun Olam. And they basically give two suggestions here. Why? And we're back to the first takana here. Why mipnei Tikun Olam? Okay, so now, mishum. Now, because they're asking a question, Hai means this. So this Tikun Olam that we're talking about, is it mishum duchka ditziburahu? Oh, Dilma is, or perhaps, I'll explain in a minute what duchka ditzibura is, or perhaps mishum de lo ligravu v'leite tfei. Now, how did I know to stop there? I knew to stop there for two reasons. Number one, we're asking a question and they're giving a this or this. The key word there is the word "o," right? Which is telling me this or that. That's the question. There's two sides to the question. Then the next tip is that the word tafshin, that is a short for tashma, which means come and learn, which is basically a quote from some source coming from somewhere else. We'll talk about what it might be, okay? But it's basically bringing in some other source. In this case, I'll already preface it by saying, I wrote this in the sheet, but tashma is always an intro to some source taken from somewhere else. However, some words in the Gemara are function words that's very clear. We're now going to have an introduction to a Tanaitic source, and it's going to provide a contradiction to something we learned previously. Or there's all sorts of words that have a very specific function. Tashma is a word that's very vague. It's a term that basically means come and learn, meaning come and learn something from somewhere else. We're going to bring it here and we're going to use it for some purpose. Maybe it'll be for a question. Maybe it'll be to bring an answer. Maybe it'll be a proof. Okay. So in our case, since we started with a question, it's obvious that when it says tashma, it's already bringing an answer from some other source. So then we're going to have this story. Again, I'm really focusing just on punctuation here. To Levi bar Darga parke labarte b'tzleisar alfe dinare zahav. Okay, he redeemed his daughter for 13,000 dinarim. We'll get back to that. To which Amar Abaye says, which means he's responding to that proof. And he starts off with the words of a question. Uman le malanen, who is to say? And basically, he's obviously going to reject that proof. So without really understanding everything yet, I already know there's a question. There's two possible answers to the question. The Gemara is going to bring a source, it's going to give an answer, and then Abai is going to reject them. That's the simple reading of the Gemara. So now let's read the Gemara, and then we'll get more in depth to understand a little bit even more. So the question is, this Tikun Olam that we're not allowed to redeem captives, is it because of ducha ditziburahu? Is it because we don't want to inconvenience people that they're going to have to, if we allow this captive and they want a huge ransom and we basically bring up the money, we find the money, but it's basically going to put the whole community out because they're all going to collect money. And we don't want to put out the community that they have to spend a lot of money on this. Or Dilma mishum de lo ligravu v'leite tfei. Maybe we're worried that if we give into this captive situation and we pay them money, what are they going to do tomorrow? They're going to say, hey, look, this was a good, easy way to get money. Let's do this again. And they're going to take more captives. So while we have in our minds, and this is where we're going to start to get to this individual, we have an individual who's really struggling. He's been taken captive. He's stuck. He wants to get home to his family. On the other hand, if we save him, we're only creating a situation where more people will be taken into captivity. So the question is, what's the big issue? Is it that we're worried about the financial burden on the community? Or is it that we're worried that this is just going to create a situation where we're going to have more and more captives? I'm going to stop for a minute before we go on, and I'm going to look in Rashi here. So Rashi explains, right? So Duchka Ditzibur, he just explains what it is. I'm not going to read through that because we already explained it. But when he says Odilma on the second part, or perhaps Deloyim silu ovdei kochavim nafshayu, right? That the ovdei kochavim won't end up trying to take more captives. V'ligravu v'leitei tvei. Mipnei shemechurim otam biyokel, because they see they could get a lot of money. Okay, so that's again just the explanation. But then Rashi adds something very important. So Rashi often just translates, and it gives us some extra words that we might not have known. But here Rashi adds something important. He says, v'nafkamina. What's the practical halachic difference between these two? Right? Normally, here we're just getting to it. Okay, we know you can't do it, and it's either this or that. What does it really matter? So he says, no, it really matters because, and this is always what they're discussing. Nafkamina is one of the biggest words you'll hear in learning Gemara, which is we want to know what's really the relevance of saying this or that. So he says, "V'nafkamina im yesh lo av ashir o karov sherotze lifdoto b'damim harbe." If he has a rich father or a rich relative, or it doesn't even have to be rich, it could just be someone who's willing to put themselves out of money that wants to redeem him, b'damim harbe v'lo yipileu al tzibur, and it won't become a burden on the community. Then again, it depends where you go. If you say dufka ditzibur, a financial burden on the community, this is clearly not a financial burden on the community. The family's willing to take it upon themselves. But if you're worried that tomorrow they're going to go take more captives because they're going to see how much money they got, well, they're going to do the same thing again tomorrow if you redeem your child, let's say. So in this case, Rashi, right, that if you go by the second interpretation, you'll say you actually still can't redeem this person. Okay, so that's a very important nafkamina. Okay, going back to the Gemara. So then Tashma, they bring in this source. What's the source? It tells the story of Levi bar Darga, Parka lebarte b'tleisar alfei dinarei zahav. So he redeemed his daughter for 13,000 dinarei zahav. So what do you see here? If he redeemed his daughter for so much money, clearly it was okay that he did it. I say that even though it's not really clear, and we're going to get back to that. But right now they're going to assume if he did it, it must have been okay. And therefore it must be that is dukkha de tzibura, because here he did it for his own daughter. It didn't inconvenience anybody else in the community, and that's why it must have been allowed. Now, what I want to stop here before we get to Abaye, or maybe we'll read Abaye, and then I'll point out the difficulty here. Amar Abaye, uman lemalan dibirtzon chachamim avad, dilma shelo b'ritzon chachamim avad. Who's to say that Levi bar Darga was going in the way of what the rabbis wanted? We know lots of people around that don't necessarily do things in the right way. Just because he redeemed his daughter doesn't mean it was the right thing to do. And this is a great example of how the Gemara approaches a story. Stories often are actually much stronger than opinions. Often we hear this rabbi said that rabbi said that. And often when we hear that, we think, oh, must be they really believed it. And, but oftentimes we see when they actually do an action, it's much stronger than their words because actions are stronger than words. And therefore, when a rabbi actually does something, it actually has much more significance than if they just said that that's their opinion. But in this case, it's not a rabbi doing it. And because of that, the question is, how do we treat this? Sometimes they say, well, look, he did it and nobody complained or something like that. But Abaye says, we have no way of knowing really if he did this, if this was really what the rabbis wanted or it wasn't what the rabbis wanted. And therefore, Abaye basically throws out this proof. Now, the question here becomes, if Abaye throws out the proof, what does this mean? Does this mean that Abaye got the last word in and that this proof is out the window? And if the proof is out the window, it must be that Abaye held that he really couldn't do it. It seems like Abaye is saying, this isn't really what we should be doing. And really the answer is that we're worried more about future captives being taken and therefore we shouldn't allow this at all. But it's not clear because sometimes Abaye, when he comes and rejects a source, he could be just saying, look, this proof isn't a good proof, but it doesn't mean that I have an answer to the question. It means that this proof goes out the window. We're back where we started and we're left with a question. So it's a very interesting question and there's really no good answer to this question. But what I wanted to show you here is that if we move forward to the Meiri, who is a commentary from Provence, he says in the, I think, 1300s, he basically says here, Farber, I'll read it inside, She'ein podin et hashvuyim b'yeter mechdei demehem, v'lo mishum duchke ditzibura. He says it's not because of the financial burden on the community. And he says very clearly, Ela mitama de lo ligru behu, v'leite tvei. It's so that they don't take more captives. And where does he get this from? He gets this from the fact that Abaye says, I don't think that this guy did this according to the rabbi's wishes. And therefore he reads it. And again, I'm pointing this out because there's two ways to read this. As often anyone who's been learning Gemara already knows that there's many ways of reading it. And his reading is it must be because Abaye rejected that source. We don't look at it as, proof, get rid of the proof. So basically, let's remove it and we're back where we started. No, he doesn't view it that way. He thinks that Abaye has the last word because Abaye is saying, really, it's an issue, and we don't want to allow people to redeem their own children because of the problems it's going to cause in the future. Okay, so that's where we are right now. Then that's the first. So now we're done with the first section. We're going to get back to it in the second part of today's class. But now we're going to get to the second section. I don't know if you all got here, so I'll read it as I read everything anyway, but I'll read it also so we get through it together. That's basically just a quote from the Mishnah. And there's a very short Gemara on this, which says a lot in a few words. My beinayu. So exactly the question we didn't understand. What's the difference between saying it's Tikun Olam or it's Takanat Shvuyim? Ika beinayu deleka elachad. What if there's only one person in jail? Okay, we're going to assume this is like a jail, and we want to try to help this person escape. If he's the only one or she's the only one there, then there's going to be a difference between Tanakama and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And this doesn't help us very much because what does that mean? So Rashi helps us in explaining what this means. Deleka elachad. So sometimes you have to read Rashi as if this is what's called the Dibor HaMatchil. That's the words that introduce. Rashi is referring to the words Deleka elachad, but sometimes you have to read it as a straight line, meaning you don't stop at the Dibor HaMatchil and take a pause. Okay, so Rashi is talking about the words Deleka elachad. Sometimes Rashi reads as a straight line, which is Deleka elachad shavoi. Okay, so he's taking the words of the Gemara and then he adds one more word and that's his sentence. There's only one captive. So Tanakama, who said Tikun Olam, Chayesh l'tikun olam kulo. Tikun olam means we're looking at the whole picture, which means that we're worried not about today, but about the future. So yes, there's only one captive now, but Shema yikbetzu al hashvuyim ha'atidim lavo. If they help this person right now, as time goes on, they'll take other captives over time. And then they'll say, oh, well, last time they helped the guy escape from jail. Well, they'll tie them up and they'll make their lives much worse. And because we have, and here we get to the difference between Tikun Olam and Takanat Shvuyim. Tikun Olam is this global perspective, future perspective, not just the here and now, but we have to look at what might happen down the road if we do this. The second thing, Rabbi Shimon, which is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, lo chayish elim ken yesh shvuyim acherim imo. He's only worried if there's people in jail at the time. Shema yikbetzu hashabaim liyasam b'yisurin. There's concern that they're going to be tortured. Right? I'm thinking of the case where recently some people escaped from jail. Remember that story? Not so long ago, right? And then I'm sure that I don't remember the details, but I'm sure they took the people that were in jail with them and they probably tortured them to get information out of them, right? So if we try to help people escape from jail, they'll punish the people that are still in jail. So if there's only one person in jail, then we're not worried about the people that are in jail. But if you're worried about Tikun Olam, which is a broader thing, which is the future, then you have to worry about it. So this sounds like almost like a technical machloket, but it's a very fascinating machloket because what it's really getting at is this concept of how far do we have to go? What do we have to be thinking about when we're doing one action? Our actions were not, number one, individuals. Our individual actions have effect on the community. They have effect on the future, not just here and now, but they have effect on what might happen 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road. If we act in a particular way, even though it looks to us like the most important thing is this individual and saving this individual, sometimes the ramifications are much more severe. And what the Tikun Olam is basically saying, or one way of looking at it is that the individual, right? Often in Judaism, we say, right, one person is like a whole world. And sometimes you have to save one person, even if it might sacrifice others. But in this case, we're saying, no, when it comes to this issue of captivity, and we're going to have to get to, are they talking about even if it's in danger of life threatening? And that isn't discussed yet. Only later are the Rishonim going to bring up that issue. Are we talking about a life-threatening situation? Are we talking about where they might make them leave the religion? Are we right? We don't know exactly what the situation is, but they seem to be clearly saying the difference between individual and the community. And the community is more important. And are we talking about worried about future or present, right? And that's also a question. Then that's part of the debate between these different opinions. So we're going to stop here. I'm going to send you to Chavruta for about 15 minutes. And we'll come back. The truth is, I'll send you to Chavruta till 9:45. We'll come back, and for 15 minutes, I'll summarize the second section. What we're going to do in the next section is a little bit more complicated, but you'll see. I broke it down. It's very important. When you get to Chavruta, I started with a Tosfot, which is very complicated in the beginning. I don't want you to read it and understand it yet. I want you to go through the questions as I ask them on the sheet and follow the questions. And through that, Tosfot's going to basically quote. What Tosfot likes to do is to say, wait, there's a different sugya, okay? We're learning right now, Gittin 45a. But if you look at a different sugya somewhere else and another sugya in a different place, you'll see that that doesn't really fit in with our sugya here. Our sugya seems very clear. We don't redeem captives, right? In any case, really, unless maybe, the nafkamina that Rashi talked about. But generally, we really don't redeem captives. However, there's going to be two sugiyot, which seem to indicate possibly otherwise. And the question what Tosfot's going to try to come up with is, how do we resolve this contradiction between the sources? So I'm going to send you to Chavruta now, back to your breakout rooms. If you have any technical issues, please just write to me or to Maggie, and we will help you sort them through.